woke up to 47 dead fish floating in my lake. And the HOA president had the nerve to call it community maintenance. The problem? That lake feeds their own water system. I bought this property 5 years ago for one reason. The lake. Not the house. Not the acreage. Not even the privacy. It was the water. A natural, spring-fed lake that had been sitting there long before anyone thought about carving up the surrounding land into neat suburban lots with identical mailboxes and HOA-approved shrubs. When I first walked the property with my realtor, the water was glass still, reflecting the tree line like a painting. I remember thinking, this is mine. No shared docks. No community rules. Just mine. Back then, the subdivision next door was still under construction. Developers marketed it as Lakeview Estates. Even though none of the homes technically owned lake access, they just had a view of it. My lake, framed nicely behind a thin line of trees, separating my pasture from their back fences. I didn't mind. A view doesn't equal ownership. The property lines were crystal clear in county records, on tax maps, and in my deed. The entire lake sat comfortably within my boundaries. For years, everything was peaceful. I'd fish on Saturday mornings, usually before sunrise. I maintained the shoreline, kept invasive weeds under control, and even stocked the lake responsibly to keep the ecosystem healthy. If neighbors waved from a distance, I waved back. A few even thanked me for keeping the lake clean since, technically, it improved their property values. I had no issue with that. I wasn't the type to start trouble. The first sign something had changed was the new mailbox cluster at the entrance of the subdivision. The old wooden sign that simply read, Lakeview Estates, had been replaced with a larger stone monument engraved with the HOA's full legal name. That S, when I heard there had been a board turnover. New president, new enforcement committee, new community vision. I didn't think much of it until that Saturday morning. The sun had just started to burn through the mist rising off the water. I was standing on my dock, coffee in one hand, fishing rod in the other, enjoying the quiet hum of insects and the distant sound of sprinklers from the neighboring yards. It was peaceful in that way only early mornings can be. Then I heard someone clearing their throat behind me. Not loudly, just deliberately. I turned around and saw her standing near my fence. Karen, though I didn't know her name yet. Perfectly pressed athleisure outfit, oversized sunglasses despite the low light, phone already in her hand, angled slightly upward like she'd been recording before I even noticed her. Excuse me, she called out. You can be doing that. I glanced around instinctively, half expecting she was talking to someone else. Doing what? Fishing, she replied, as if I'd just been caught trespassing in a government facility. This lake is designated as a community scenic resource. I blinked. This lake is on my property. She shook her head in that slow, condescending way that suggests she believes she is correcting a child. When you purchased land within an HOA-managed community zone, you agreed to abide by the association's bylaws. I actually laughed. I couldn't help it. It was so absurd I thought maybe this was some awkward attempt at humor. She didn't laugh back. I am not in your HOA. I said, my property predates your subdivision. She lowered her sunglasses slightly and looked at me over the frames. Sir, that's not how community governance works. Community governance. That phrase stuck with me. I set my coffee down on the dock railing. I've never signed anything with your HOA. I don't pay dues. I am not a member. This lake is entirely within my deeded property lines. She took a few steps closer to the fence. Phone still up. The board voted last week to classify the lake as a protected aesthetic feature of Lakeview Estates. Fishing constitutes resource extraction. Resource extraction. I repeated. Yes. Removing fish alters the natural balance and affects the scenic quality for homeowners. I stared at her, trying to process the logic. I stock this lake. I maintain it. If anything, I am the reason there are fish in it. That may have been the case before. She replied coolly. But the HOA now has environmental oversight. That S when the shift happened. It wasn't just about fishing anymore. It wasn't even about the lake. It was about control. I walked toward the fence, closing the distance between us. Let me make this simple. This is private property. You don't have jurisdiction here. She didn't back up. Instead, she zoomed in slightly with her phone camera. I am documenting non-compliant behavior. On my land. Yes, because the lake impacts our community. I could see a few curtains twitching in the houses behind her. Neighbors watching, curious, waiting to see how this would play out. Listen, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I've been fishing here for years. No one else ever had an issue. That's because prior leadership was lenient, she said. We correcting that, as if my existence had been a clerical error. I picked up my rod again, more out of principle than anything else, and cast the line back into the water. The lure hit the surface with a soft ripple. She inhaled sharply. If you continue, we'll be forced to pursue enforcement measures. Through who? I asked. The fish police. She didn't smile. Through legal channels. There it was. The threat. Not shouted. Not dramatic. Just calmly delivered like she'd done this before. I realized then that this wasn't a misunderstanding. She genuinely believed the HOA had authority over something it had never owned. And worse, she believed repetition would eventually make it true. You should review the updated bylaws. She said, we distributed them last month. I didn't get anything. I replied, that's because you haven't registered with the association. Because I am not part of it. She paused, just briefly, as if that detail inconvenienced her narrative. Then she adjusted her sunglasses back into place. We'll be in touch, she said, and just like that, she turned and walked back toward the subdivision. Phone still in hand, I stood there on my dock for a long moment, staring at the still water. The peace of the morning was gone. The quiet felt heavier now, like something had shifted beneath the surface. For 5 years, that lake had been a source of calm, a simple pleasure, a private retreat. But standing there, replaying her words in my head, community governance, environmental oversight, legal channels, I understood something important. This wasn't about fishing. It was about the HOA expanding its reach, testing boundaries, seeing how far authority could stretch before someone pushed back. And I had a feeling I was about to find out just how far they were willing to go. The email arrived 3 days later. Not in my inbox. I am not on their mailing list, but forwarded to me by one of the few reasonable neighbors who still had my number. The subject line read, Emergency Environmental Review. Lake safety concerns. I opened the screenshot and immediately recognized Karen S. tone. Polite, clinical, urgent in a manufactured way. According to the message, several residents had reported disturbing ecological disruptions caused by unauthorized private fishing activity. The lake, it claimed, was a shared environmental asset, critical to the neighborhood's visual harmony and wildlife stability. The board would be holding a closed-door meeting to discuss protective action. From me, I drove down to the subdivision clubhouse that evening, not because I was invited, but because I wanted to see how this was unfolding. The parking lot was fuller than usual. A few residents stood outside in small clusters, whispering. When I approached, conversations softened. Inside, through the large front windows, I could see Karen at the front of the room. A projector screen glowed behind her with what looked like a slideshow. Charts, photos, bullet points. It looked official, the kind of presentation designed to overwhelm people with the illusion of expertise. I stepped through the door. The room went quiet. Karen didn't look surprised. She looked prepared. This is a board session, she said evenly. Homeowners only. I am here because you rediscussing my property. I replied. A few heads turned. Some people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. We rediscussing environmental risk factors affecting Lakeview Estates. She corrected. I crossed my arms, which just happens to include my lake. She clicked a remote. The screen changed to an aerial image of the neighborhood. My property was outlined in red. The lake circled dramatically in blue. As you can see, she said to the room, ignoring me now. The lake sits adjacent to multiple residential lots. Any ecological imbalance impacts property values. One of the residents raised a hand. Is there proof of imbalance? Karen clicked again. A photo appeared. Me. On my dock. Fishing. Zoomed in. Timestamp visible. There has been repeated extraction of aquatic life without HOA environmental authorization. I couldn't help it. I laughed once. Sharply. You make it sound like I am strip mining. She kept her composure. Overfishing can destabilize oxygen levels and wildlife populations. I stock the lake. I said. I maintain it. I test the water twice a year. There were murmurs at that. Some surprised looks. Karen's smile tightened slightly. Independent testing is not recognized under HOA standards. That was new. Apparently, standards could be invented at will. She changed slides again. Now there were charts. Generic ones, clearly pulled from the internet, showing how fish population shifts could affect algae growth. None of it referenced my lake specifically. It was theoretical, broad, vague enough to sound alarming. We propose, she continued, a temporary suspension of all fishing activity, pending a full environmental review. A man near the back spoke up. Who's paying for that review? The association. She replied smoothly, which meant everyone in the room. A few eyebrows rose. And if the review finds no issue? Someone else asked. Karen hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. Then we reassess. Reassess. Not restore. Not admit error. Just reassess. I stepped forward. Let us skip the theater. This lake is not part of your HOA. You can suspend activities on land you don't own. Karen finally faced me directly again. When environmental consequences extend beyond property lines, jurisdiction becomes a shared concern. That's not how property law works. She tilted her head. We let the attorneys clarify that. There it was again. The legal threat, delivered like a chess move. But then she shifted tactics. Several residents have expressed concern about declining wildlife visibility. She said, scanning the room, children enjoy watching fish from their backyards. We have a responsibility to preserve that experience. There it was. Not science, not ecology, aesthetic control. A woman in the front row raised her hand timidly. I haven't noticed fewer fish. Karen's smile didn't falter. That's because depletion happens gradually. Another resident, older, arms crossed, said, has anyone actually tested the water? Karen clicked to the next slide. A generic stock photo of murky water with floating debris. This is what can happen without oversight. That's not our lake. Someone muttered. The room's confidence in her narrative began to thin slightly. I could feel it. So could she. That's when she unveiled the final piece. Additionally, she said, voice lowering just enough to regain control of the room. The lake connects to the community's irrigation runoff system. Any contamination could cycle back into shared green spaces. Now that caught attention. I frowned. What irrigation runoff system? She didn't answer me directly. Instead, she displayed a simplified diagram of underground drainage lines. Arrows pointed from the subdivision toward the lake, then back toward a retention basin near the clubhouse. It looked official, technical, complicated enough that most people wouldn't question it. But something felt off. After the meeting adjourned, abruptly, before I could push further, I lingered outside. A few residents approached me quietly. Do you really test the water? One asked. Yes, I said, and I keep records. Could we see them? Anytime. Another neighbor leaned in. This feels extreme. It is, I replied. As people filtered out, Karen exited last. She locked the clubhouse door behind her and walked toward her car. I stepped into her path. You re-escalating this for no reason, I said calmly. Her expression hardened slightly now that the audience was gone. Control of shared environments is never unnecessary. It's not shared. It influences us. That dose and tea make it yours." She paused, studying me like she was recalculating. "You could cooperate," she said. "Voluntarily suspend fishing. Participate in the review. It would demonstrate goodwill. Goodwill implies mutual respect." Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You remaking this adversarial?" "No," I said. "You are." For a moment, the polite veneer slipped. Just a flash. Frustration. Annoyance at resistance. Then it was gone. "The board will proceed," she said evenly. "With or without your participation." She got into her car and drove off. I stood there in the dim parking lot lights, replaying the meeting in my head. The slideshow, the vague science, the carefully phrased threats, the subtle attempt to convince residents that my private property was somehow a communal asset. It wasn't about fish. It wasn't even about environmental concern. It was about narrative control. If she could convince enough people that the lake was shared, then the legal reality might start to feel secondary. Perception can be powerful, and HOAs thrive on perception, on the idea that collective rules override individual ownership. But she made one mistake. She introduced that irrigation diagram. Because if there really was a physical connection between their system and my lake, then the dynamic wasn't what she thought it was. And suddenly, I wasn't just defending fishing rights anymore. I was starting to question who actually depended on that water. The smell hit me before I even reached the dock. It was faint at first, metallic, sour, like something stagnant baking under the sun. I'd come down later than usual that morning. Work had kept me up the night before, and the sun was already high, burning off the last of the mist that normally floated above the surface. As I walked through the grass toward the shoreline, something felt wrong. The birds were quieter. The usual ripples from fish breaking the surface were gone. Then I saw the first one, a bass, belly up near the reeds, drifting slowly against the edge of the bank. I stopped. For a second, my brain tried to rationalize it. Fish die. It happens. Age. Disease. Natural cycle. Then I saw another. And another. By the time I reached the dock, there were dozens. Some small. Some large. Bluegill. 2 catfish. Even a carp near the far side. Pale underside exposed to the sun. The water near the shoreline had taken on a faint cloudy tint. Not dramatic, but wrong. Wrong enough that my chest tightened. I crouched at the edge and dipped my hand in. The water felt normal. Cool. Clear enough below the surface. But the smell was stronger here. I stood slowly, scanning the perimeter. The lake had been healthy 2 days ago. I'd walked this same shoreline at dusk. Fish had been active. No discoloration. No signs of stress. This wasn't gradual. This was sudden. My first thought was runoff. Heavy rain can wash chemicals from nearby lawns into water sources. But it hadn't rained in over a week. The ground was dry. The sky had been clear. I pulled my phone out and started recording. Slow pan across the water. Close-ups of the fish. Timestamp visible. I narrated what I was seeing, keeping my voice steady even though my pulse was climbing. Multiple dead fish. Various species. No prior signs of illness. I walked along the edge, counting. By the time I reached the north end, I'd seen at least 40. 40 healthy fish just die overnight without cause. My eyes drifted toward the subdivision. Sprinklers were running in several backyards. Perfect green lawns stretching toward the tree line that separated their fences from my property. Everything looked normal over there. Peaceful. Controlled. Too controlled. I moved toward the small inlet where the natural spring fed the lake. The water there was clearer. Moving gently. No dead fish near the source. That told me something important. Whatever this was, it likely hadn't come from the spring. It had entered somewhere else. I circled back toward the southern edge, the side closest to the subdivision S drainage ditch. That S when I noticed the faint residue near the surface. Not oil. Not visible enough to be obvious. But when the sunlight hit at an angle, there was a slight sheen, almost like diluted detergent. My stomach dropped. I knelt and filled a clean jar from my truck with water, sealing it tightly, then another from the opposite side for comparison. if someone had introduced something intentionally. I wanted samples before it diluted further. As I stood, I heard voices. 2 women from the subdivision were standing near the tree line, staring at the water. "Oh my God." One whispered. "Is that?" "Yes." I called out. Not angrily, just firmly. They were dead. They looked startled that I'd addressed them directly. "What happened?" the other asked. That's what I am trying to figure out. They exchanged a glance. Uneasy. One of them hesitated before speaking again. "The HOA sent out an email last night." My jaw tightened. "About what?" "Something about lake treatment. Preventative algae control." "Lake treatment." I felt heat rise up my spine. "What kind of treatment?" I asked. "I don't know." She said quickly. It just said environmental management to preserve aesthetic quality. Aesthetic quality. My mind flashed back to Karena's slideshow, to her talk of oversight, of environmental risk. "You saw them do something." I pressed. They shook their heads almost in unison. "No, just the email." I thanked them and turned back toward the water, trying to keep my breathing steady. If the HOA had authorized some kind of chemical application, without my consent, on my property, they hadn't just crossed a boundary. They detonated it. I walked the perimeter again, looking for signs of entry. Tire tracks, footprints, anything. Near the drainage culvert on the south side, I found them. Fresh marks in the dirt. Not deep, but recent. The grass flattened in a line leading toward the water's edge. And there, partially hidden in the weeds, was a small white plastic cap, the kind that fits on a large chemical container. I picked it up with a glove from my truck and slipped it into a bag. This wasn't runoff. This wasn't natural. Someone had accessed my property. My phone buzzed. A new email, forwarded again by the same neighbor. Subject: successful preventative treatment completed. I opened it. The HOA board was pleased to inform residents that a proactive ecological balancing treatment had been applied to the lake to prevent potential algae bloom and maintain visual clarity for the summer season. Applied to my lake, without notice, without permission, without testing. My hands was steady now, not shaking, just focused, because here's what they didn't understand. This wasn't a decorative pond in a gated community. This was a living ecosystem. Spring-fed, carefully balanced. I knew the fish counts, the oxygen levels, the seasonal cycles, and whatever they added hadn't just balanced it. It had killed it. I called the county environmental office immediately. Reported suspected unauthorized chemical discharge into a private body of water. Requested urgent testing. Then I called a private lab I'd used before and arranged for expedited analysis of the samples I'd taken. By late afternoon, more fish had surfaced. The smell grew stronger. And the subdivision. Quiet. Too quiet. No one was outside now. No sprinklers running. Curtains drawn, as if ignoring the problem might make it disappear. But the truth floats. And by sunset, my shoreline was lined with it. As I stood there watching the light fade over a lake that had been healthy just 48 hours earlier, I realized something else. They hadn't just harmed my property. They acted with complete confidence, which meant they believed they were protected. By bylaws, by perception, by the assumption that no one would push back hard enough to matter. They thought they were enforcing aesthetics. What they actually done was create evidence. And unlike fish, evidence doesn't decompose quietly at the bottom. It rises to the surface. By the next morning, the county environmental inspector was standing on my dock, staring out at what used to be a healthy ecosystem. He didn't say much at first, just crouched near the shoreline, gloved hand lifting one of the dead fish carefully into a sample bag. He'd seen this before. That much was obvious, but the tightness in his jaw told me this wasn't routine. How long? He asked. Less than 48 hours. I replied. No prior signs of stress. Spring-fed source is clean. I've got water samples from both sides. He nodded approvingly when I handed them over. Good thinking. We walked the southern perimeter together. I showed him the flattened grass, the tire impressions, the plastic cap I debagged. He photographed everything. Did you authorize any treatment? He asked. No. Did anyone contact you? No. He exhaled slowly through his nose. All right. By noon, a second vehicle arrived. This one from the State Environmental Quality Department. Apparently, when a private freshwater body connected in any way to downstream systems, jurisdiction expanded quickly. That irrigation diagram Karen had shown at the meeting, it wasn't entirely fiction. What she hadn't explained was that the subdivision stormwater management system drained into a retention basin that, during heavy overflow, redirected excess water toward natural low points, including the outer edge of my lake. It wasn't a constant feed, but it was a connection, and that meant something critical. If chemicals were introduced improperly, they didn't just stay put. They moved. By mid-afternoon, I had confirmation from the private lab. Elevated levels of copper sulfate and an algaecide compound commonly used in decorative pond treatments. The dosage wasn't mild. It was aggressive. Whoever applied this, the lab technician said over the phone, didn't account for volume. This concentration is typical for small ornamental ponds, not natural lakes. I thanked him and hung up. Copper sulfate. Cheap. Effective. Dangerous when misused. I already knew who had authorized it. The question was whether they followed any legal process before doing so. The county inspector made a few calls from his truck. When he returned, his expression had shifted from clinical to concerned. We contacted the HOA management company. He said they confirmed hiring a landscaping contractor for aesthetic water treatment. Did they mention ownership? I asked. He gave me a look that answered the question before he spoke. They told the contractor the lake was under HOA jurisdiction. I let out a slow breath. They trespassed. I said, yes. He replied, and potentially more than that. The state official stepped in. If runoff from this lake reaches the retention basin, and based on topography, it can during overflow events, then the chemical introduction becomes a regulatory issue. In plain English, I asked, they may have contaminated part of their own water management system. That when it clicked fully, Karen had tried to claim oversight because the lake impacted the subdivision. What she hadn't considered was that influence runs both ways. By late evening, the HOA board received official notice. Cease all unauthorized environmental interventions immediately. Provide documentation of chemical quantities, contractor licensing, and environmental impact assessments. The panic began quietly. My phone buzzed with messages from neighbors. Not angry this time, but nervous. Is our irrigation water safe? Are we going to be fined? Did the board really not get permits? Permits? There weren't any. The next day, a county vehicle parked outside the HOA clubhouse instead of my property. Through the trees, I could see Karen's car already there. By afternoon, word spread fast. The landscaping contractor had admitted under questioning that he'd been instructed to apply a standard algae prevention treatment based on the surface area provided by the HOA board. No one measured depth. No one calculated volume. No one tested baseline chemistry. They treated my spring-fed lake like a decorative fountain behind a shopping mall. Worse, the contractor had accessed my property via the drainage easement path, which allowed utility inspection under specific circumstances, not chemical application. That detail mattered. Easements don't transfer control. They grant limited access for defined purposes. This wasn't one of them. By the third day, preliminary findings were clear. Fish kill caused by excessive copper concentration. Environmental damage categorized as preventable and human-induced. And then came the part Karen never anticipated. Because during deeper review of the subdivision's water management maps, the State Department discovered that the retention basin connected to a groundwater recharge zone feeding a municipal backup supply line. Not primary drinking water, but backup, insurance water. the kind cities rely on during drought or infrastructure failure. The contamination levels detected in the basin weren't catastrophic. Dilution had reduced concentration significantly, but they were measurable. And measurable means reportable. The HOA hadn't just poisoned my lake. They had introduced unapproved chemicals into a system tied indirectly to a regulated municipal resource. When that finding hit their inbox, the emergency board meeting they once held to control me turned into something very different. I wasn't invited. Of course, but I didn't need to be. Because the same residents who once watched quietly from behind curtains were now demanding answers. Why didn't you verify ownership? Why didn't you get permits? Why didn't you inform homeowners about the risk? And the most devastating question of all, are we liable? HOA boards operate on confidence, on the assumption that authority equals competence. But once fines enter the conversation, potential state penalties for unauthorized chemical discharge, confidence evaporates quickly. By the end of the week, the HOA's legal counsel contacted me directly. Polite tone, carefully worded. They requested a meeting to discuss remediation and cooperative resolution. Cooperative, that word again. The same board that had tried to suspend my fishing rights now needed my cooperation to limit fallout. Because remediation wasn't simple. Restocking fish costs money. Water quality restoration requires time and professional oversight. Sediment testing might be necessary. Ongoing monitoring would be mandated. And every dollar tied back to one decision, an unauthorized attempt to control something they didn't own. As for Karen, her public confidence had cracked. At the next open community forum, which I attended quietly in the back, she spoke less, deferred more to counsel, avoided eye contact when my name came up. Control had shifted, not because I yelled, not because I retaliated, but because facts don't bend to bylaws. The investigation had exposed everything. The overreach, the negligence, the assumption that perception could override property law. And now, the same Lake Shidi tried to classify as a community scenic resource had become documented evidence in an environmental compliance case. Standing on my dock that evening, watching the last of the damaged fish being removed for analysis, I felt something settle inside me. They had tried to redefine ownership through narrative. Instead, they decreated a paper trail, and paper trails are far more powerful than HOA policies. Because once government agencies get involved, authority stops being a performance. It becomes real. And real authority doesn't care about aesthetic control. The official notice arrived on a Monday morning, delivered not just to me, but to every homeowner in Lakeview Estates. It wasn't written by the HOA. It was from the county. The subject line alone shifted the tone of the entire neighborhood. Notice of environmental violation and mandatory remediation. By the time most residents finished reading the first paragraph, Karen's phone was probably already exploding. The findings were clear. Unauthorized chemical discharge into a private freshwater body, improper dosage, failure to verify property ownership, violation of state environmental protection guidelines, mandatory restoration plan required, potential civil penalties pending review, and then the line that truly changed everything. Due to hydrological connectivity between the treated lake and the subdivision's stormwater retention system, further testing of associated groundwater recharge zones will be conducted. In simple terms, the lake they had tried to control was now directly linked to the safety of their own water management infrastructure. Within hours, the HOA scheduled an emergency open meeting. Not a closed-door board session this time. An open one. Residents only. But I received a separate call from their legal counsel inviting me to attend as a property stakeholder. That alone told me how far things had shifted. When I arrived, the clubhouse parking lot was overflowing. People stood outside, some holding printed copies of the violation notice, others scrolling through neighborhood social media threads filled with panic. Inside, the energy was completely different from the first meeting. No projector slides, no polished charts, just tension, Karen sat at the front table with two other board members and a man in a gray suit. Their attorney. She looked composed at first glance, but there was a stiffness in her posture that hadn't been there before. The attorney spoke first. The association acknowledges that a contractor was engaged to perform algae mitigation services under the belief that the lake fell within HOA environmental oversight. Murmurs rippled through the room. Belief. Someone called out, "You didn't check." Karen leaned toward the microphone. "We acted in good faith to preserve community assets." "It wasn't your asset." Another resident snapped. The attorney cleared his throat. "Ownership verification was insufficient." Insufficient. That word carried more weight than any argument I could have made weeks earlier. A homeowner stood up near the middle row. "Are we going to be fined?" "The association may face administrative penalties." The attorney replied carefully. "Those would be covered through HOA reserves or, if necessary, special assessment." Special assessment. That phrase hit the room like a dropped glass. "You mean we're repaying for this?" someone demanded. Karen jumped in quickly. "We are exploring all options, including contractor liability." "But you authorized it." The same homeowner shot back. For the first time, Karen didn't have an immediate answer. I stayed silent. There was no need to speak when reality was doing the work for me. The state's preliminary estimate for environmental restoration wasn't small. Fish restocking, sediment analysis, ongoing water testing, professional ecological consultation, monitoring for groundwater impact. Every line item represented dollars, and those dollars traced back to a decision made in a board meeting where fishing had been described as resource extraction. Eventually, the attorney turned toward me. The association would like to discuss a cooperative remediation plan. There it was again. Cooperation. But this time, it wasn't framed as a request for compliance. It was damage control. "I am listening," I said calmly. Karen avoided eye contact. "The HOA proposes covering full restoration costs." The attorney continued. "In exchange for a mutual non-litigation agreement." Several residents turned to look at me. Not with hostility, with something closer to apology. Because now they understood. This hadn't been about community harmony. It had been about overreach. "And the fines?" someone asked. The attorney hesitated. "Administrative penalties are separate from restoration." Translation. Homeowners might still be paying. The room erupted into overlapping conversations. Why wasn't this vetted? Why didn't you ask him first? Who thought this was a good idea? Karen finally spoke again, but her voice lacked the sharp authority it once carried. "We acted to protect property values." A resident near the front stood slowly. "You hurt property values." Silence followed that statement, heavy and undeniable. Because she was right. News of environmental violations travels fast, especially when public records are involved. Realtors pay attention to that kind of thing. Prospective buyers ask questions. A scenic lake was an asset. A documented contamination event was a liability. Over the next week, more details surfaced. The contractor's insurance refused full responsibility, citing incomplete information provided by the HOA regarding water volume and jurisdiction. The state confirmed that, while groundwater contamination remained below hazardous thresholds, monitoring would continue for months. The county assessed a moderate but very real fine. And the HOA reserves, not nearly as robust as Karen had implied during previous meetings. By the following Friday, rumors of a recall vote began circulating. Control, once seized so confidently, was unraveling. Karen attempted one last move. She sent a neighborhood-wide email framing the incident as an unfortunate miscommunication exacerbated by resistance to community alignment. Resistance, as if my refusal to surrender private property rights had caused them to pour chemicals into a lake. The response was immediate and brutal. Residents replied all. They cited the violation notice, the lack of permits, the financial exposure, the unnecessary escalation. One homeowner wrote simply, "You tried to regulate what you didn't own." That line spread quickly. Within 2 weeks, a special board session was held. Karen resigned to allow the community to move forward without distraction. Distraction. That's what the poison lake had become in the official narrative. But no one in that room believed it. The new interim board reached out to me directly. Not with demands. Not with authority. With questions. How can we prevent something like this again? Is there a way to clarify property boundaries publicly? Would you be willing to share your water testing data periodically? The tone had changed entirely. Respect tends to follow consequences. Restoration began under professional supervision. The lake would recover. Ecosystems are resilient when given time. New fish would be introduced gradually. Water chemistry would stabilize. But the bigger shift wasn't ecological. It was cultural. The HOA learned something expensive and unforgettable. Influence does not equal ownership. Proximity does not equal authority. And aesthetic preference does not override property law. Standing on my dock months later, watching young bass break the surface again, I thought back to that first morning when Karen told me I couldn't fish on my own land. They had tried to control the water. Instead, they exposed themselves. Because the moment they acted without verification, without consent, they turned a disagreement into a documented violation. And violations have consequences. Not dramatic courtroom showdowns. Not shouting matches. Just paper. Reports. Fines. Resignations. The kind of quiet accountability that sticks. The lake was never theirs. But the lesson, that belonged to the entire neighborhood. If you enjoy HOA drama like this, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next neighborhood meltdown, fire,